Dense tropical heat clung to the air like a wet blanket as two hikers traced an unruly ridgeline above the cliffs of northern Okinawa. The trail wasn't marked. It wasn't even much of a trail at all, just the faint impression of old stone steps hidden beneath creeping vines and tangled roots. The pair moved slowly, brushing aside hanging ferns and ducking under branches heavy with moisture, until the forest suddenly thinned and the earth beneath their feet turned hard. Limestone, weathered, cut by human hands long ago. They stopped. Ahead, half swallowed by jungle growth and time itself, stood a rectangular opening carved into the hillside. The moss around it looked older than the hikers, older than their parents, as if it had grown undisturbed for generations. The entrance was no more than 4 feet high, reinforced by rotting timbers and algae-green rock. Something about it felt wrong, too deliberate, too quiet, like a mouth holding its breath. They squeezed inside. At first, only darkness. Then, as eyes adjusted, shapes emerged, dusty ghosts frozen in the stillness. A rusted helmet slumped in the corner, the faded outline of a once proud eagle, globe, and anchor barely visible through corrosion. A decayed field pack. A rotted canvas water canteen collapsed like old skin. The smell was earth, metal, and time long gone. Along a wall lay fragments of uniforms stiff with age, rank chevrons bleached by years of dripping limestone and humid air. Whoever had been here hadn't just passed through, they had lived here, fought here, waited here, left here. Against the back stone wall sat an ammo crate sealed shut by rusted clamps and a century's worth of dust. The hikers hesitated before prying it open, the wood splintering under pressure. Inside was no ammunition, no grenades. Instead, wrapped in stiff waterproof cloth and brittle like autumn leaves, lay a small bound notebook, pages yellowed, edges curling, ink spider-faded but intact. As fingers lifted it, a dry crackle whispered through the chamber. Someone had written this. Someone had been here, deep in jungle no one visits, hiding or trapped, during a war most only remember through films and history books. The hikers didn't speak. They didn't need to. They knew. They had not just found a relic. They had found a story the world believed had ended 80 years ago. But here, in this silent limestone tomb, the war wasn't over. It had only been waiting to be found. Spring, 1945, Okinawa. The sky above the Pacific churned with smoke, steel, and the roar of engines that never seemed to sleep. The island had become a battlefield of mud and hellfire, Marines pushing inland inch by inch, Japanese forces dug deep into limestone caves and ridges that swallowed light like a hungry beast. For months, the world had been narrowing to this place, a coral fortress where survival meant fighting the earth itself. Amid the chaos and thunder of artillery, a small squad of 12 U.S. Marines was handed orders unlike the rest. They were not to charge beaches or hold crossroads. They were to disappear into the island's northern wilderness. Their mission was quiet, dangerous, and wrapped in secrecy. Reconnaissance, no glory, no headlines. Track suspected mountain supply routes used by Japanese forces moving unseen through the hills. Confirm positions, return alive if fate allowed. Leading them was Sergeant William Red Colton, a man whose jaw seemed carved from the same bedrock as the cliffs that guarded the shoreline. He had fought on Peleliu and Guadalcanal, seen enough death to carry it in his eyes. Alongside him walked Clarence Hale, radio operator, burdened by a pack heavier than fear itself, and Jimmy Stokes, the medic barely out of high school but already old in ways no teenager should ever be. The rest of the squad carried their rifles, their hopes, and letters, folded into breast pockets, reminders of a world waiting across the ocean. They moved north, away from the thunder, away from command tents and steady supply lines, into hills where even seasoned Marines hesitated to tread. Locals whispered that the mountains themselves watched intruders, that the wind carried voices, that the jungle remembered every footstep of every soldier who entered and never came out. The squad shrugged off superstition. War leaves little room for ghosts. Yet as the canopy thickened and the world narrowed to the rustle of leaves and the distant thud of unseen artillery, A quiet dread crept in. This place was different. Hesitation lived in the trees, shadows clung longer than they should. And somewhere beyond the green veil, unseen paths wound towards secrets dug deep before any American boot touched this soil. 12 Marines marched into the hills with maps, orders, and confidence. None knew the island had other plans. Before the jungle swallowed them, before their names became footnotes in forgotten war files and aching prayers in kitchen windows back home, they were just 12 men breathing the same humid air and carrying the same impossible weight. Sergeant William Red Colton walked point always, tall, broad-shouldered, hair like a match flame under his helmet. Back home in Iowa, his mother kept his high school football photo framed over the mantel, telling visitors he'd come back and build houses, start a family, live a simple life. Red's letters home were short but steady. "Mom, don't worry, we're tough, we'll see this through." Yet in the dark of the tent, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands, he whispered to his squad that Okinawa felt different. Like the land didn't just hide soldiers, but watched them. Beside him marched Clarence Hale, the radio on his back bending his spine like a yoke. The smallest in the squad from a factory town in Pennsylvania. He wrote long letters every night, pages filled with talk of home-cooked meals, and a girl named Lydia who promised to wait for him. His handwriting started bold in 42, slanted with fatigue by 44, then finally ragged by 45, like the war itself had begun dragging the ink down toward the dirt. Clarence joked too loudly, laughed too quickly, trying to drown the gnawing truth that radios die, batteries fade, and sometimes calling for help means letting the world hear you scream. And then there was Jimmy Stokes, the medic, barely old enough to shave. He carried morphine, bandages, and the naive belief that he could save everyone. Back home in Georgia, his kid sister kept every letter he sent, rereading them until the paper softened under her fingers. Jimmy never talked about fear. He talked about going home to start medical school, how war was temporary and life would resume after. But war has a way of lying to boys like him. The rest of the squad followed these three, the way soldiers follow hope. They moved with jokes, curses, sweat-slick camaraderie, brotherhood forged not by patriotism alone, but by knowing the man beside you was the only thing between life and oblivion. They were last seen heading north through chest-high grass and twisted banyan roots, rifles slung low, radio hissing faint bursts, 12 shadows marching toward mountains that swallowed sound and light. No one imagined that would be the final glimpse. No one believed the jungle would keep them for decades without a whisper. On the second morning after their departure, the radio crackled like old bones snapping underfoot. Clarence's voice cut through static, strained and breathless. Movement in the trees. Not sure if ours. Tunnels in the ridgeline. Looks dug, not natural. Pause. Muffled whispers. A sharp breath. Then silence broken only by a long, hollow hiss. Operators back at command tents leaned in, tried tuning frequencies until the dials trembled, but no reply came. No coordinates. No cries for help, just a jungle swallowing noise and men with equal appetite. By the third day, routine concern thickened into dread. Patrols swept along ridges and stream beds, boots sinking into mud rich with decay. The hills answered with cicadas and wind through bamboo, nothing more. The officers logged it as delayed contact. Men got lost all the time in terrain like this, but those who had marched these paths before felt a prickle beneath the collarbone. The North wasn't like the rest of Okinawa. It breathed differently. And sometimes it breathed back. Search teams expanded as battles raged elsewhere. War does not pause for the vanished. A week passed, then 2. Reports dwindled. The squad's gear was never found. No rifles, no ration tins, no boot prints sunken into clay, not a scrap of cloth or a twisted cartridge. The jungle simply shrugged and kept its secrets. After the war, when victory parades echoed across the Pacific and families lifted photographs to lips in whispered thanks, the North remained silent. Veterans who'd fought near those hills spoke in lowered voices about caves that led nowhere, about tunnels colder than the earth around them, about the feeling of being watched by eyes that weren't human or living. Command finally stamped the file with bureaucratic closure. Missing, presumed Kia. The families received folded flags and condolences laced with hollow certainty. Decades rolled on. The ridge curved into memory. Tourists hiked beaches, not jungles. But sometimes, locals said, when fog pooled thick around the limestone and night patrols walked too close to the old paths, they heard faint radio static where no radios existed, branches snapping in perfect rhythm, footsteps that never quite reached the clearing. No bodies, no gear, no peace, just silence that lingered like a warning, and the echo of 12 men who marched into green hell and never marched back. Long before Marines carved foxholes into its soil and battleships ringed its shores, Okinawa was an island whispered about in low tones. Locals spoke of spirits that walked between trees at dusk, of ancient limestone caverns where old kings prayed for safe passage between worlds, and of hills where the wind didn't move branches, only memories. War didn't invent fear here, it simply stirred what already lay sleeping. After 1945, the stories didn't fade. They sharpened. Farmers tending sugarcane on humid evenings swore they saw flickers of pale light dart through the forest ridges, as if men carried lanterns underground. Children walking home from school heard rhythmic footsteps behind them on mountain paths, only to turn and find nothing but bamboo, swaying, and cicadas, crying like warnings layered over warnings. In quiet fishing villages along the northern shore, elders gathered over bowls of broth and sake, voices hushed when mentioning the abandoned tunnels, fighting-era passages once used for shelter, storage, and defense. Some were natural, some carved, many sealed after the war, and some, locals claimed, closed themselves. In those hills, people said the line between the living and the lost blurred. More than once, fishermen returning late claimed to hear English drifting through the trees. Not the clipped commands of modern troops, but tired voices talking softly, as if discussing rations or directions. Sometimes it wasn't voices but the faint click of metal, like someone checking a rifle bolt in the dark. One elderly woman swore she encountered a gaunt figure in torn uniform trousers near dusk, pale-faced beneath a helmet dripping with moss. She froze as he stared at her with eyes confused, frightened, unreal. Then she blinked, and he was gone, swallowed by leaves without a sound. The village priest blessed her house 3 times that week. Hikers, even decades later, spoke of pressure in those hills, a feeling of being accompanied by footsteps, just a half-second off their own pace, as if someone followed without quite daring to catch up. The locals never scoffed. "Respect the quiet places," they'd whisper. "Leave offerings if you pass near old caves. Say hello when you cross, forgotten war ground, and goodbye when you leave. And whatever you do, don't answer when the jungle calls your name after dark. Because on Okinawa, some voices didn't belong to the living, and some souls never laid down their burdens. They only hid deeper, waiting." When the gunfire finally stopped, and the island exhaled its first breath of uneasy peace, the search began. Lists of the missing were typed on rattling machines in steamy tents, names inked into ledger books with trembling hands. 12 Marines marked, 12 families waiting. Patrols swept the hills where the squad had vanished, moving through dripping foliage with weapons lowered, but hearts climbing their throats. They expected battle scars, spent shells, boot prints in clay. Something, anything. Instead, they found only silence, damp earth, and the heavy stillness of a jungle that seemed to swallow sound whole. Report after report came back empty. A stray helmet found weeks later belonged to a different unit. An abandoned canteen too rusted to identify. The war had churned the ground into a graveyard without markers. Command sighed, wrote their summaries with clinical detachment, and moved on to the next missing platoon, then the next. War doesn't halt for ghosts, it buries them in paperwork. By autumn, headquarters stamped the squad's file. Killed in action, cause presumed enemy ambush. A neat bureaucratic sentence masking a chasm of unanswered questions. The decision wasn't cruel, it was convenient. Armies cannot chase mysteries when the world demands victory, parades, and reconstruction. And so the hills sealed their lips, and the official record sealed the squad's fate. Back home, the letters arrived in quiet houses like funeral bells. Mothers unfolded government stationery with hands that already knew the truth but still prayed to be wrong. Wives sat at kitchen tables, staring at black ink, until tears smudged names into blurs. Younger siblings ran to the mailbox, hoping for handwriting familiar and bright, only to receive folded flags large enough to cover dreams but too small to fill the silence that followed. Some families asked questions, pressed officers, requested maps of where their sons vanished. Answers came thin, polite, rehearsed: dense jungle, heavy enemy presence. Difficult recovery terrain. Then soft condolences. Then nothing at all. Life marched forward, even as memory stood guard at windows every night, waiting for boots on gravel that never came. Eventually, the file joined thousands like it in a metal drawer, tucked away in a government warehouse where fluorescent lights hummed and dust settled like ash. Officially, the men were gone. Unofficially, they lingered in minds and nightmares and whispered island legends. Their war had ended, their story had not. Today, Okinawa carries its history like a scar under sun-bleached skin, beautiful, green, and humming with life, yet forever shadowed by what happened here. Tourists come for beaches and coral, but others arrive chasing echoes. History enthusiasts with metal detectors, archaeologists pacing coordinates with ground-penetrating radar, tunnel explorers lowering themselves into limestone mouths still blackened by wartime soot. Hikers who wander off trails not looking for adventure so much as answers. Every few months, someone finds something. A rusted M1 bayonet tangled in vines. A dog tag worn smooth by decades of rain. Bones bleached white and quietly laid in soil, thick with centuries of memory. Each discovery is treated like both miracle and wound, a whisper from men who never got to speak their last words out loud. Government recovery teams still walk these hills, boots crushing wild fern while they gently brush dirt from helmets and fragments of boots that once carried hope across oceans. Volunteers join them, some veterans, some descendants, some simply drawn to the gravity of unfinished stories. Their mission is solemn: bring home who can still come home. But not everyone who searches walks the same path. A different crowd prowls the undergrowth, eyes bright with thrill rather than reverence. They slip into caves, pocket buttons, pry loose rust-streaked ammunition crates, souvenir hunters, relic hoarders, TikTok explorers chasing clicks in the land where men bled and vanished. Locals frown when they see fresh boot prints near old cave mouths. In village bars, men murmur disapproval into their sake. You don't steal from the dead here. Respect or greed, memory or spectacle. The island feels the difference. Even hikers unaware of legends notice the shift when they step into shaded ravines where wind goes still. One wrong laugh too loud. One idle comment about spirits. One careless touch of rusted steel left in place for a reason. The jungle listens. The ground remembers. And sometimes when night falls and the cicadas hush all at once, search teams swear they hear faint radio static drifting through bamboo. A ghost signal from 1945, pulsing through roots and limestone tunnels. Not quite lost, not quite gone. As if someone out there is still trying to call home. The notebook felt fragile enough to crumble under breath alone when the hikers lifted it from the ammo crate, its cover stiff like thin bark, its pages stuck in places where mildew had tried to erase history. The ink inside bled in faded veins, letters clinging to existence after 8 decades underground, but somehow, impossibly, the first pages still spoke. The handwriting slanted and strong, the style of a man trained to write fast while the world shook around him. Day 3. Terrain worse than maps show. Hills cut like teeth. Mud knee-deep. Rations low. Hale says radio battery dying faster than expected. No panic yet, only grit and irritation scrawled into the paper like a promise to return. The next entries darkened in tone. Heard something last night in the tree line. Not enemy. Too quiet. Too slow. Then, saw movement between cedars. No contact. Shadow? Animal? Hale swears someone watching us. The edges of the page rippled where moisture had kissed fear. A later line, heavier, as if carved rather than written. Food nearly gone. Water from stream tastes wrong. Then scribbles. Ink dragged like a shaky hand. Lost one to fever. Buried him on ridge. God forgive us. The writing turned uneven. Sentences shorter, punctuation abandoned. Things in trees at night. Not birds. Steps above caves. No talking, only breathing. The notebook smelled of earth and rust and dread preserved like a trapped breath. The final pages broke into fragments, as if the writer's thoughts were splintering faster than he could catch them. Tunnels not empty. Voices not ours. Something waiting in dark. A last line nearly torn by pressure of the pen. Do not trust. The ink trailed off, jittered, then ended in a jagged slash across the page, as though the hand holding it had jerked hard at the final second. No date, no signature, no neat farewell to fold into a government file. Just a message caught between worlds without context or closure. When the hikers looked up from the brittle paper, the bunker felt smaller, the air colder. The jungle outside no longer seemed simply alive. It seemed aware, and the notebook in their hands didn't feel like history. It felt like a warning that arrived 80 years too late. The bunker wasn't a panic hole scratched into rock by desperate men. It was deliberate, measured. Someone had planned to stay here. The hikers noticed it first in the small details, the kind you only see when you pause long enough to feel the weight of a place. Along one wall, limestone had been chipped into shelves, crude, uneven, but unmistakably intentional. On those shelves sat jars once filled with water, glass fogged, lids rusted where hands had tightened them decades earlier. Nearby lay tangled fishing line and hooks twisted from wire as though someone had carved necessity out of nothing. Whoever hid in this bunker had adapted to the island not just to survive a day or two, but to endure. In the corner stood an improvised stove built from field ration tins stacked and blackened with soot. Charcoal dust still clung to crevices like fingerprints from ghosts who refused to burn away. A strip of canvas, stiff and brittle, hung from a timber beam. It might once have been a curtain for privacy or light control, or simply the last attempt at dignity in a place the world had forgotten existed. This wasn't panic. This wasn't flight. This was settling in. The way a man might build routine when hope is still alive and rescue is still imagined as footsteps thudding through the brush. Ration tins lay split open by bayonet tip, scooped clean. Empty morphine syrettes curled like tiny dead snakes near the back wall. Amid dust and decades lurked human touches, a chipped enamel cup, fingerprints etched faintly in its glaze, a bit of twine braided tight, likely used to bind something precious or broken. They lived here, ate here, slept under a roof carved from stone while rain hammered the island and voices echoed beyond the ridgeline. They weren't ambushed in a flash of gunfire. They weren't swallowed instantly by the jungle. They fought time, hunger, fear, the slow suffocation of isolation, long enough to build, to hope, to try. And that truth made the bunker feel heavier, like the air itself mourned what came next. Hope lived here once, and hope died here too. If this had been a battlefield, the walls would have told the story: shrapnel scars, bullet pocks, spent casings embedded like fossils. But the shelter was untouched by violence. No smashed helmets, no ruptured canteens. The ammo crates sat intact, cartridges tarnished but whole, waiting for rifles that were never fired in defense. Bayonets remained sheathed, webbing straps still looped as though hands expected to unbuckle them again soon. Even the medical kit, half used, told a quiet story. Someone was treated. Someone lived. And then, nothing. No firefight. No frantic last stand. No signs of blood or struggle. It wasn't death by enemy hands. It was absence swallowing men whole. On the bunker floor lay stones arranged in a circle where boots once sat around embers for warmth or sanity. Beside it, a stick of chalk rolled near the ledge, a soldier's habit, used for marking maps or counting days. One wall bore faint scratches, not words, not tally marks, just grooves like someone tracing time with shaking hands. The silence in this place wasn't aftermath, it was expectation frozen. They had prepared for an attack crouched in shadows, rifles within reach, ears trained for footsteps crunching bamboo. But the enemy never came, and that was worse. Being hunted and fighting back is human. Waiting for danger that never arrives is torture of a different kind. It frays reason, it stretches nights into things longer than war should allow. They were ready. Ready to fire, to defend, to die with noise and fury. Instead, the jungle gave them no target, no battle cry, no victor. Just rustle of leaves and distant water dripping through caves. They came armed for war, and instead faced something far colder, abandonment by fate or by command or by the island itself. In the end, they did not lose a fight. They lost time, hope, strength. Men trained to charge forward died standing still, surrounded by ammunition and courage, neither of which could save them from an enemy they never saw, and perhaps one that was never flesh to begin with. The notebook's middle pages weren't just worn, they felt bruised, like the paper itself remembered suffering. The handwriting lost its confident slant, dragging itself across the page like a man crawling through mud. The words grew shorter, clipped, haunted, rain again, whole night, flooded entrance, tried to sandbag, everything damp, cold in bones. The steady control of a trained Marine had cracked, leaking dread between lines, Stokes coughing blood. Hale says fever. No quinine left, food nearly gone, we ration rice like gold dust. Outside, monsoon rains hammered the limestone, turning paths into rivers that swallowed footprints before memory could form. The bunker, once a refuge, became a coffin that filled from the corners inward. Pages smelled of mildew, as if the notebook had absorbed each storm that trapped them. Each night they sat in darkness, listening to water drip through stone like a clock counting down. Then an entry written in a desperate scrawl. 3 went for help, Red led them, said mountain pass quicker. They took radio battery, promise return soon. Underneath, lighter ink, as though written hours later by a hand trembling from fear or exhaustion. Never returned. Days bled into each other, the tone frayed, hearing things, steps above, can't tell if wind or men, or something else. The jungle, once merely hostile terrain, had become a presence, an intelligence. Night sounds sharpened to razor edges in their minds. Tropical birds, or something moving slow, patient, curious. Then a sentence that chilled the hikers as they read it in the half-light of the bunker. There is singing in the hills at night, not theirs, not ours. The ink pressed deep, as if the writer dug the pen into the page hard enough to anchor himself to sanity. Singing where no one lived, voices drifting through rain like half-remembered hymns from a place no living man belonged. And then another scrawled note, do not follow it. Stokes tried. Pulled him back before he crossed tree line. His eyes empty after. Kept saying someone calling him. Beneath that, jagged lines were sentences once lived but had been scratched out in panic or regret. Hunger gnawed, fever spread, hope unraveled. The notebook didn't just record desperation, it absorbed it, and now every brittle page whispered the same terrible truth. Death didn't take them all at once. It took them slowly, whispering through branches, calling from hills, until the men who survived longest weren't fighting the enemy anymore. They were fighting the island itself. Legends cling to Okinawa like morning mist, and not all came from soldiers. Village elders spoke of that spring long after the war ended, voices low as if afraid the jungle might overhear. Farmers tending hillside taro fields told their children of strange shapes moving among the pines in the weeks after the fighting faded. Not Japanese soldiers slipping home, not American patrols clearing stragglers. No, these figures walked hunched, cautious, almost unsure of their own limbs like animals learning to stand again. Skinny, pale beneath layers of grime, helmets streaked with moss, foreign faces staring through foliage as though seeing a world they no longer recognized. One elder swore he saw them at dawn trailing through morning fog, silent as ghosts, eyes hollow like men who had forgotten language, only instinct left. Words spread in murmurs. America, Haishi. Not dead, but not living either. Villagers left small offerings, rice wrapped in cloth, sweet potatoes, dried fish, and one evening the offerings vanished without sound. The next morning, a single object lay in their place, a button, green and corroded, embossed with an eagle clutching anchor and globe, a trade, a thank you, or a pleading. One fisherman recalled visiting a nearby hamlet 2 hills over. He remembered whispers that a trio of gaunt Marines approached under moonlight, rifles slung weakly, uniforms tattered like ancient fabric. They didn't speak, only gestured hunger with shaking hands. The villagers, torn between fear and pity, offered rice and water. The men bowed stiffly, as if remembering manners from another life, then melted back into trees without turning their backs like soldiers expecting ambush even from kindness. Days later, villagers returned with more food. The clearing was empty. Only disturbed ferns and faint footprints remained. After that night, no one ever saw them again. But the forest kept whispering. Dogs refused to enter cedar groves. Children swore they saw helmets glint through branches before dusk swallowed the hills. And when wind swept through bamboo at midnight, villagers sometimes heard soft footfalls out of sync with nature, as if 12 men still moved through the undergrowth in staggered formation, searching for a way home long after the war forgot their names. Some said they finally succumbed to jungle fever and hunger. Others insisted they crossed into the mountains where ancient spirits dwell. But a few, those who believed in things the living refused to say aloud, swore those men never fully died at all. They simply kept walking, somewhere between duty and oblivion, following trails no map ever marked, forever marching through pines that refused to release them. Near the end, the writing took on a frantic pulse, as if each stroke of the pen was fighting through exhaustion and dread. The once steady script descended into jagged tremors, sentences slanting downhill like a man stumbling through mud. Smudges bloomed where rain or tears or shaking fingers blurred ink into bruises across the page. It felt less like someone documenting events and more like a life trying to outrun the dark closing in. Rations gone. Hale barely moves. Stokes won't speak, only hums. Sounds like church hymns but wrong tune. Trying to get him to eat. He stares at wall like he sees something there, then a brief return of clarity, as if adrenaline cut through fever. Heard metal scraping above last night. Like boots on rock. Thought maybe our boys. No answer to signal. Don't think they're ours. Under that, drag marks where the pen caught rough paper. Whispering, whole night. Sound like English but not words I know. The sentence wound into panic. Tunnel above wind, sounds like voices. We are not alone. The ink pressed deep, biting the page. A line scratched through something unreadable. Then the very last trace of the writer's hand. If we don't make it, nothing more. The nib had scored into the paper and stopped mid-sentence, mid-breath, mid-hope. No farewell, no date. Just an abrupt silence where fear outpaced ink. The hikers stared at that unfinished line in the dim bunker light, hearts beating like they expected the author to walk in and finish it. The jungle outside rustled with a breeze that didn't belong to the tidy world of museums and textbooks. It belonged to the hills that still kept secrets under their moss-choked ribs. A war story shouldn't end this way, with ellipses instead of certainty, with voices instead of answers. But war rarely grants neat endings. It buries men in time and earth and rumor, leaving only scratches on paper to tell what the living weren't ready to hear. The notebook held its silence like a wound, and the bunker around it felt suddenly smaller, as if someone had just stepped out, or stepped closer. Sometimes history waits politely to be discovered. Other times, it watches from the shadows, grateful you finally opened the door. When authorities arrived and sealed the site with yellow ribbon and hushed voices, science began where legend ended. Archaeologists, military historians, and forensic specialists picked through soil and rusted metal with gloved fingers and reverence. First came the soot, collected delicate as ash from a funeral urn. Carbon testing placed it firmly in the spring of 1000. 945, matching the notebook's dates. The tiny stove wasn't improvised fantasy, it was lived, in fire, meals cooked for men who still believed rescue might crest the ridge. Nearby, bone fragments lay half-buried in clay, softened by decades of rain, human, weathered. Some tiny like finger bones, others long and curved from legs that once marched across oceans. Enough to know suffering lingered here. Not enough to name each ghost. A rust-eaten spoon, engraved faintly with initials. An enamel cup chipped on one side, teeth marks along its rim created by a man drinking while hands shook. A single dog tag lifted from dirt like a prayer answered, corroded but legible. Hail, Clarence R., the radio man, the one who wrote home about Lydia, promising a return he never saw. The metal had fused to soil, as if the island refused to give it up easily. No weapons fired, no bullet holes, no bloodstains in stone. It wasn't battle that consumed them, but attrition, isolation, illness, and a land indifferent to human desperation. Experts mapped the bunker's layout, traced tool marks on limestone, confirmed a long-term shelter built under duress by trained hands. They measured rust thickness on spent ration tins to estimate time, weeks, maybe months. Not a brief disappearance, but a slow unwinding of strength and hope in darkness. A colonel reviewing the findings whispered, almost afraid to say it aloud, "At least 5 survived long after command, wrote them off." Outside, the jungle hummed. Cicadas rose in waves like distant artillery, and wind pressed against leaves like footsteps approaching, then pulling away. The forensic team packed samples, bagged artifacts, logged coordinates. They left respectfully, as if tipping hats to unseen sentries. Science brought clarity but not comfort. Numbers and carbon dates filled reports, but none could answer why rescue never came, or what moved above the tunnel mouth in the night, or whose voices whispered through rain. The past was illuminated just enough to ache, enough to know they survived longer than anyone ever believed, and enough still hidden to suggest the island hasn't finished telling their story. When the first remains were lifted from the earth and placed into flag-draped transfer cases, it felt less like discovery and more like overdue remembrance. Repatriation teams worked quietly, voices low beneath the weight of history. In Washington, dusty files long thought closed were reopened, names spoken aloud again after decades of bureaucratic slumber. Officers dialed numbers for families whose grief had aged into something brittle, almost sacred. Some relatives were gone, but others answered with voices quivering under the shock of a phone call they had stopped praying for years ago. A granddaughter in Pennsylvania pressed a trembling hand to her mouth when she heard a name she'd only known from framed photographs and faded letters. A man in Georgia, now white-haired and stooped, sank into a chair clutching his father's dog tag found in a bunker on an island he'd never set foot on. For some, tears flowed freely. For others, silence spoke louder than any sob, relief and ache tangled until they were indistinguishable. Ceremonies followed. Honor guards stood stiff under morning sun, rifles gleaming, flags snapping in the wind like ghosts saluting ghosts. Names read aloud carried weight, each syllable a bridge across 80 lost years. These men had once marched into the unknown believing someone would come for them. At last, someone did. Their story, once smothered by jungle and time, breathed again. Not as myth, not as rumor, but as truth written into the bones of a hill and the ink of a notebook that refused to rot. Historians updated records. Families placed medals and photographs beside urns that felt lighter than the legacy they held. And somewhere deep inside Okinawa's northern ridges, the jungle exhaled as if releasing a burden older than many who now walked its trails. Yet this closure was not perfect, because war rarely grants perfect endings. Some remains will never be found. Some voices will never finish their final sentence. Some footsteps vanish into moss without explanation. But now, at least, the world remembers them not as missing but as men who fought to exist until the very end. Even today, hikers who pass that ridge at dusk lower their voices without knowing why. They speak of sudden stillness in the trees, of gravel shifting under no visible foot, of the faint murmur of English drifting through bamboo like breath caught between this world and the next. Maybe it's imagination, maybe wind, or maybe it's a squad still marching home in perfect formation, boots echoing softly through time, unwilling to rest fully until the last man is accounted for and the island finally lets them go. War ends on battlefields. But for the forgotten, it only ends when someone remembers they were here at all. This story was intense, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.